Okay, and I need to read through our hearing script. Basically just covers the procedure of the hearing, then we'll jump right into it. So this is the January 5th, 2022 session of the Zoning Hearing Examiner docket. My name is David Sturkey. I'm the Zoning Hearing Examiner for the City of Cincinnati, and I'll preside over this hearing. The case before us today is case number ZH20210179. The purpose of this hearing is to allow applicants and opposing parties to testify and to offer and refute evidence and testimony. This hearing will follow the rules found in the zoning code and the supplemental rules of the Zoning Hearing Examiner. All testimony and evidence that an applicant or any opposing party wishes to offer, must be presented at this hearing unless a party has opted to submit evidence or testimony in the form of writing prior to this hearing. The hearing will proceed as follows. The applicant's attorney, or the applicant's agent will first present the applicant's case. If there were anyone here from the public that wanted to speak, they would have that opportunity after the applicant had presented its case. I'll give the zoning department an opportunity to provide any testimony. In the event any party testifies or offers argument in opposition to this application, the applicant shall have an opportunity to rebut that testimony and or argument offered in opposition. And then finally, the applicant will have an opportunity to make any closing statements. After all presentations have been made, I will close the hearing. Decisions may be expected within 2 weeks. I may limit or exclude any testimony that I deem irrelevant or outside the scope of the application being considered. I may interrupt any speaker to ask questions or to make any comments. I may also refuse to consider hearsay testimony or documents. That's generally evidence you want to introduce that consists of statements made by someone who's not present at this hearing. In the event of any technical difficulties or unforeseen circumstances, I'll do my best to troubleshoot those on the fly, but to the extent there's some defect in the tech that prevents us from meaningfully going forward with the hearing, I may continue or postpone this hearing at my discretion. Okay, last thing to do is just swear in all of our witnesses. If you intend on providing any testimony here today, making any comments, asking any questions, doing anything other than just strictly observing, and you're not an attorney, then you need to be sworn in. So if that is you, if you could take yourself off mute and raise your right hand. I need everyone to answer out loud. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you shall give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay, great. Okay, Luke, you can orient this presentation however you want. I mean, you guys can go one at a time, or you can ask him questions. However you feel comfortable. It's wide open, the format.
Yeah, what I was going to do is just walk through a relatively brief argument, and then in the middle of that, bring in Brian to talk through a couple points. Okay. So I'll just jump into it.
Sure. And I know there's a lot of different signage, and you know, if you have any thing you'd like to share your screen or anything.
Oh yeah, I will want to share my screen. So
feel free to do that at your pleasure.
Okay. So let me just first start by saying, you know, I appreciate the staff's engagement in this process throughout. I've been talking to the staff for a very long time now about this possibility. And, you know, as with all things in my experience of the city, they've been great. And we really appreciate the sort of process and we went through to sort of work through this. And it's just, I think I'm going to say this a few times in the course of the presentation, but I think what this really boils down to, and the reason that there was so much time spent with the staff, is that this is really a sort of square peg round hole scenario where you have these sign regulations in 141139 that are designed for the downtown dense office district that are being applied by, you know, arguably historic accident to stadiums, right? To Paul Brown Stadium, to Great American, to TQL. Although I can't recall if I know TQL is in the PD, but I also can't recall if it's actually might be in the West End district technically. But in any event, you just with what's in front of us, which is Paul Brown Stadium, you're wrestling with standards that were designed for something else. And I think what that has been acknowledged, you know, there's been many appearances before this ZHE and predecessor ZHEs around these issues. And I think the consistent position of the administration and the applicants and the decisions of the ZHE have been, yes, we recognize this is a sort of apples and oranges scenario, and we're going to do our best to sort of make a rational, reasonable application of these rules, or we're going to use the variance process to sort of deal with the fact that this doesn't really make sense. And so that's sort of what we've been doing. And I think what we'll have to continue to do until, which as an aside, I would recommend someday that we all consider making a different set of zoning rules for these types of things. So you don't, you know, everyone's not having to go through this sort of brain surgery every time you want to try to apply these standards. So again, appreciate the engagement with the staff. And I think that's an important way to sort of table set this whole application and the whole issue we're facing. I do think it's important, again, to start with the idea that we, I think from the staff report, and again, from previous city precedent, I think we all agree that it's not reasonable to apply strictly the standards of 141139 to this to Paul Brown Stadium. They're not designed for a structure like this. So what that gets us to is, as is helpfully laid out in the staff report, there's some 15,000 square feet of signage that's already previously been approved. Well, actually, I should say something more like 22,000 square feet of signage that's either been previously approved through variances or through other mechanisms. That is, and then within that, the remaining 7,882 that are basically, and I'm going to put up a quick diagram, David, for your reference here shortly, but so you've got 22,000, let's call it rough, that have been approved in the past and or are sort of fit in under other standards, like windows, for example. And then you've got 7,800 roughly in this request. And of that 7,800, the staff agrees to approve 3,242 of that. And anybody, Doug, you can check me on these numbers when you speak, but the staff agrees with approving 3,242 of that. In addition to, I think, the roughly 7,800 that staff sort of put into a different category and would approve from our request here. So throwing a lot of numbers out, but these are all in the report, as well. So we're left with 4,280 of square feet of sort of disagreement. And that is 7 actual locations for signs around the stadium. I think it's important to frame that as that 4,280 of square footage is according to the total square footage facade numbers that we get from Elevar as a designer and architect of the stadium, is 1.4% of the overall stadium facade. And that's, I think, just the physical facade doesn't include the sort of open areas of the stadium, which when you to put that into the whole entirety of like the sort of footprint is even more than that. So I do think it's important to say we're talking about a very small number here that's in dispute, and a very small number that is actually extremely small number relative to the overall stadium we're talking about here. So here's, as an overview quickly of what we are, I gotta share what we're specifically talking about. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, I've got a little weird screen situation here. I'm going to turn off my camera really quick while I do this. So we have, just quickly to sort of orient you, David, here's the total sort of visual of the request of the signs. And I've marked in this is what was in our request, and I've marked what the staff report recommends for approval. Some of these are ones that either the staff report recommends approved for variance, or in the instance, for example, of this window sign, that is actually the staff's determined that's allowed under a different sort of section of the code. So when you put all these together, and this is to show you visually what we're looking at, and also to go through what's recommended for approval and denial, we have a few that are in dispute. So one is this wall sign here at on the west side of the stadium at Gate A. This is the part facing away from downtown. You have here on the, what is this? This is the north side, sort of facing toward downtown north. You have these two signs over here, this wall sign and this sort of complementary wall sign back here around Gate C right here. And then on Gate B, you have this sort of concrete facade, which is sort of right behind the gate, and then this escalator right behind the gate. And I want to just, we'll call you forward to this, but we're going to look at several other stadiums around, particularly our peer stadiums in the region, but also around the country, that have these exact signs around their gates, these exact type of locations, almost exactly. The other sign is on here on the east side. This is facing towards the banks. And we're just talking about this one sign here along the wall. And then finally, on the south side, we have toward the river. So this is just facing towards the river, and we're talking about the escalator. So that's that's the sort of number, that's the spaces we're talking about. And then, sorry, that is, those are the physically what we're talking about, and those are the 7 spots where we had disagreement. So let me jump into the standards of review. Okay. As you all know very well, we've got 1445, 15, and you've got to find one of those two is met. And I would argue, and we're going to talk through why I think both of them are met. But in particular, why I think since they are both met, I think that calls for sort of our full proposal to be approved, not merely the part that the city administration agrees with. So first, I think the first part's kind of easy, which is the standard around, is this an unreasonable application? Is strict application provisions unreasonable and result in practical difficulties? And again, I think that's been agreed upon by everybody over many years. And so I hope that doesn't really need to be discussed very much, just as a general concept. So we agree on that. That's in the staff report. That's the reason for their recommendation. That's the reason for that's justification for past variances that have been granted. So now we get to the second standard, which is the variance is necessary for the preservation and enjoyment of a substantial property right possessed by owners of other properties in the same district or vicinity. And I think what I'd like to argue is this is why, to me, that this standard is the standard when combined with the first standard being met, I think calls for the full nature of our proposal being approved when you compare it both to TQL Stadium as something in the same vicinity, and then also other NFL Stadium, which I think it's worth considering other NFL stadiums for the reason that the premise of this standard is that you don't want to treat one building substantially different than the other buildings around it. You don't want to, if a building down in the DD district, for example, has a certain expectation of a property right based on being in that location, it's not fair to apply a different standard to someone next door for any sort of arbitrary reason. You can't really compare an NFL stadium to another NFL stadium in the same vicinity because, of course, they're not going to exist. And when you think about what the essence of the property right for that downtown business owner, that owner of a downtown office tower, for example, that's relevant to other office towers in the area. That's who they're competing with for tenants. That's who they're generally sort of compared to from a financial valuation perspective. That's the relevant comparison. When you're talking about what is important to a property right for an NFL stadium, it's not any other building in the downtown district. It's other NFL stadiums. That's their only real peer set. And so I think if you're going to apply the essence of the standard, which is treating this building fairly relative to other buildings, you have to also compare it to other NFL stadiums. And I think we're going to take through a case of why I think when you compare this to other NFL stadiums, I think there's a very strong argument that what we're asking for is sort of just normal at those stadiums and nothing out of the ordinary. So let me first, though, talk about the comparison with TQL, and this is discussed in the staff report as well. We argue in our application, I should say, that a good way to compare these two is, because we're talking about signs around the gate area, is to compare the total what the architects call the lineal gate area, which is essentially basically the square footage of the sort of gate space at each. And in this comparison between the two stadiums, it's 5-to-1 roughly between Paul Brown and TQL. And when you look at, according to the numbers that in the staff report and the city's sort of calculation of this, the total, if all of our request is approved, the total signage at Paul Brown will be something roughly around 30,000, and that will compare to the total signage at TQL, which is something around 6,000, which is that same 5-to-1 ratio roughly. Now, I do want to sort of respond and address some of the comments in the staff report, which would argue that this is not really a true one-to-one comparison. And the staff refers to sort of the overall footprints of the buildings as being the better comparison, which they say is 2 to 1. We also would then argue, well, we would then point to the differences between how much of what we're actually asking for compares to the total of what's that, meaning the amount of dispute is very limited compared to what's the TQL. So the actual difference between our proposal as far as what's disagreed upon is pretty minimal compared to what's the TQL. But also, I think it's pretty fair to say that the settings are different between Paul Brown and TQL. Paul Brown is on the river. It's surrounded by parking lots and, at least for the time being, some industrial space, other facilities owned by the county and the team and operated for the benefit of the team, bridges, and then the banks. Whereas obviously TQL is in the middle of a residential district and a dense commercial district there. And so the sort of the impact and the interaction with the surrounding areas is not apples to apples. And I would argue that PBS is much less intrusive. I don't say that in any negative way, just a different relationship with the surrounding area. And then the other element that's very different between the two is that there are many more people coming into Paul Brown Stadium. So I think the total, something close to 70,000, 65,000 is the capacity. TQL is around 24, 25,000. The people are sort of like the view lines of people coming into the stadium are much longer at PBS because of just the open space next to it. All of which points to the need for larger signs to be able to be seen by more people from greater distances. So if the sort of utility of the signs, which it's important to state, and maybe it's implicit in all of this, but these, one of the functional points of these signs is to actually be the gate identification. So that you say you go into the, for example, Verizon gate. That's after this is instituted. That's sort of how this would work. So there's a utility point to these signs. So one, I think it's being able to see, there is a very significant difference around the need for the sign. Practically, this signs need to be bigger at Paul Brown Stadium to be able to be seen. And then I think the flip side of that is that they're not as, because Paul Brown Stadium is bigger and is further away from things, the larger signs aren't as obtrusive to the surrounding area as they are at TQL. So I think what we would say is, and then the last thing I would say is actually about the staff report, is that there's I think Doug points out that of the 6,400 or so square foot of signage at TQL, some of that are different things. Some of them are not sponsor signs, which is what we're talking about here. Some of them are, I think, tenant signs for tenants at the building. Some of them are directional signs but they have, I think, sponsor type relationships on. But either way, they're sort of different categories. And to me, all that really shows is this whole thing, it's like this whole mess of trying to apply all these downtown sign rules to these stadiums. It just gets jumbled up and mushed up, and it's really impossible to have any sort of rational hard line on any of this, as far as like a black and white line where you have to draw it. And so I think when you instead assess all of these as there's several elements to this, there's several reasonable things to think through. You compare all the different ways TQL and Paul Brown are different and similar. They come out roughly, I would argue, our proposal, the net effects of it come out roughly the same as what they have there. And I certainly think from the perspective of the public's observance of this, completely the same. And that doesn't take into account, and I think this is very important, when you compare the two, and again, you're comparing how are these two similarly situated buildings treated, that's the standard. That doesn't take into account at all the roof signs at TQL, or I believe the sort of rotating, I don't know what those are technically called, but the signs that rotate along the fins. This is just to taking into account the permanent fixture signs along the rest of TQL. So I think saying that what we proposed is being treated the same as TQL is a very strong argument for all those reasons. Now, let me move to other stadiums, because I think this is actually the crux of why it's appropriate to grant the fullness of our request. the only meaningful way you can compare the property right of the Bengals' long-term lease at Paul Brown Stadium is to other NFL stadiums. That's how you understand its value. That's how you understand the legal rights you have. It's in comparison to other NFL stadiums. And I'm going to bring Brian in now to talk about about those other NFL stadiums, sort of walk through some images of other NFL stadiums, but also discuss the sort of prevalence of this around the league. So I'll just move my computer real quick. Let me share my screen. And then okay. So again, this is Brian Sells. Brian, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody too?
Hi, folks. I'm Brian Sells. I'm Chief Marketing Officer for the Bengals, and I appreciate your time today.
David, I'm not sure if you have any time limits you want to stick to. I know there's some general rules. I'm not really sure where I am on time. I'm not sure where we started, but if you want to just maybe let me know.
Yeah, I generally leave it pretty open-ended. I do have another hearing at 2. So if you could just use that as a guide, keeping in mind that Doug and Emily are going to want to comment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to anywhere near that. I just wanted to make sure.
Sure.
If there was
Other
any
than that, wide open.
Okay, great. Okay. So Brian, can you first talk a little bit about sort of, your role with the team and in relation to other NFL teams? Sure.
I'm Chief Marketing Officer. I oversee all of our corporate partnerships as well as broadcast and in our suite premium area. So I'm very involved as we look to establish more partnerships with companies on a national, regional, local level. Very involved in those conversations, and have been working with Luke since the beginning of last year on discussions with you all on gate signage and gate sponsorships.
And again, David, this was all in the applications, everything else, but I guess it's worth sort of doing a very baseline reminder that these are about signs around the gates, but they're about sponsor recognition signs. So they're about how does the team recognize its different partners and sponsors, and those sponsorships and partnerships. And we'll talk a little more about this. The gates are one part of it. They're broader partnerships across many different functions inside the stadium, out in the community, with other elements. And so that's sort of what the purpose is here, and what we're trying to work through on how to accomplish. So Brian, can we talk a little bit about just sort of across the NFL landscape? What's the prevalence of these types of gate signs and sponsorship recognition signs?
Yeah, gate sponsorships are very common across the league, across really all sports leagues, but particularly the NFL. They're really a standard practice, and there are some examples on the screen right now. You can see a few examples from New York, from Cleveland. There's an example from Green Bay, and then also from Kansas City. Flip to the next screen, Luke. We've included an example from Buffalo, Charlotte, who their stadium's kind of situated downtown like ours. San Francisco's in there, and then Nashville is the one on the lower right. But as you can see, very, very common practice at NFL stadiums.
And I'm going to switch out to the next slide. We're going to talk about, can you talk about sort of our peer stadiums? And first, can you talk about what does that mean, be a peer stadium, and how do you, in relation to these types of things?
Yeah. So when we look at, when we talk about corporate partnerships with the team, we are competing daily on a national level, on a regional level, and on a local level. But we try to compare ourselves to, what are our peers doing? And our peers are teams like Indianapolis, very close to us, like market size. Could be Pittsburgh, could be Buffalo, could be Nashville. But we try to look at those cities, not just New York or LA. We try to compare ourselves to markets like ours.
Okay, so let's walk through sort of some of those markets and what the situation looks like on those stadiums.
This is Indianapolis, and you can see there's the gate sponsorship signage is included kind of on the awning above the gates, as well as on a pylon sign outside of the gates. This next one is Cleveland, and there are two examples of Cleveland. And I don't, this shows you what they're doing up there, and we are absolutely competing with them for sponsorships within the state of Ohio. They've partnered with Meyer on a sponsorship, and you can see the signage that is not only above the gates, but it's on their escalator. It's also on the wall inside the gate, that facing the exterior. The next slide is also Cleveland. They have a partnership with with University Hospitals, and you can see the branding all around that gate. Again, not only directly above the gate, but on the escalator and walls around the gate. The next example, this is a new partnership with Tampa Fifth Third Bank. Did a partnership there, and again, they have signage above the gate as well as on the structure inside the gate, kind of facing out. So another good example of what other partnership activations look like at the gate. This is Nashville, and they do have as part of their Nissan Stadium partnership. The gates are branded and have vehicles kind of sitting on top of the gates. They also have wall signage, as you can see to the right, that is through a partnership with Farm Bureau Insurance. And then Pittsburgh, we included Pittsburgh in here. Again, more examples of how wall signage is included in gate partnerships. Interior wall signage kind of facing out toward the gate. Buffalo is another example. Again, a vehicle located kind of on top of the gate. And then Kansas City has 4 gates, and they're all pretty much identical, but you can see the Community America signage kind of directly above the gate, but there's a wall inside the gate, kind of facing the gate, and then the additional sign in the upper left of the photo.
Okay, and we can, if anyone wants to pull this back, we can, whenever.
Yeah, Luke, I was actually going to request that you send that PowerPoint at some point after this hearing. If you could share that with me, and I know that we have a version of the one you showed earlier, but if you could send the one that has the approvals and denials, that'd also be helpful. If you could.
Yep. Will do. So again, I think that lays out some good examples of the prevalence of it, but also our peer city, some of our peer markets, peer stadium. And I think, without putting too fine a point on it, they're pretty much, a lot of these are exactly the same things we're talking about for Paul Brown, and they're some of which have been recommended for approval, but some of which, the ones that have been recommended for denial, including sort of like the escalators, the concrete facades behind the gates, the walls sort of adjacent, big walls right behind or adjacent to the gate. Those are the small number of ones that are in disagreement here, and I think there's lots of examples of those around other stadium, which again, we think that's part of the property right of an NFL stadium. If you want to accurately compare who the real comparison property right. I want to dig in a little bit more on that quickly, Brian. Can you talk about, because we're talking about the ones that are in dispute here, can you talk a little bit about sort of what's the impact, if Cleveland can offer that and you can't?
Yeah, so in order, to compete with other NFL teams, we need to provide comparable value to sponsors. And, if there's a potential partner that is looking at a gate partnership with another NFL team, and they can provide, whether it's escalator signage or wall signage, they're looking for brand exposure, and they're looking for a way to stand out in these gate sponsorships to our fans as being a material sponsor of the club. So if other clubs within the NFL can provide more brand exposure for our partners, that puts us at a disadvantage.
Okay, so I think those points are fairly obvious, I hope, and I think the visuals help to make them. There's one other thing I do want to talk about with Brian, which is, and it's, I think, a really important element of this, both me and the standard and just generally this whole issue, is that again, these are not just about the gates. These sponsorship packages are sort of have many elements. And included in many or not most of them is a community element, some sort of community activity, some sort of public focused activity. And so, Brian, can you talk a little bit about sort of the Bengals' approach to that with these discussions?
Yeah, our approach to these sponsorships, along with the gate signage and all of the other marketing assets that are included within these sponsorship packages, whether that's radio, television, in-stadium signage, will always be to include a community initiative or partnership. And those things could range from, in-school physical education programming to a broader community-based, improvement projects.
I think that's important to show. One, again, just generally take a little bit of a broader lens of what we're talking about here. We're not simply talking about gate signs. One, I think this goes to the public benefit element of the standard, that there is a public benefit to quite simply, the more of these sponsorships the team is able to garner, the more of these community partnerships will exist, the more of these community events will happen. So we think that's a real, genuine public benefit, and I'm proud of it. I think that's all I have for you, Brian. Thank you. You can leave if you want, I guess, but I don't know if
I'll stick around.
Okay. So summarizing the two prongs of the argument, one of 1445-15, which is one of one of them has to justify the variance. Again, I think everybody agrees its strict application of these standards is unreasonable and creates practical difficulties. I think that we've shown clearly that when you compare us to both TQL as a similar facility, and more importantly, other NFL stadiums, what we're asking for is just to be treated in a very similar way to all of them, and to have our property right be able to exercise in the same way. And I think when you strip away all the differences and comparisons between TQL and Paul Brown Stadium, what we're proposing is very similar. And then I think clearly we've shown that the comparison to other stadiums is NFL stadium, I think, is very similar as well. It's just in line with the norm. So let me then quickly, I do want to try to quickly move through this, is to talk about 1445 or 11, sorry, I kept saying, 1445-13, which is the public benefit standard. Just on a couple of these, I want to respond a little bit to some of the comments in the staff report. I think in the zoning category and the neighborhood compatibility category, I think the staff report articulated a concern about sign clutter, and I take that as a general matter to be a real concern. I would argue here that it's not really as much of a concern here. One, again, the sort of number of signs in dispute between the staff report and ours is 1.4% of the total square footage of the whole stadium. So we're really talking about a small amount. Two, again, I think
Luke,
where we
Luke, is that sorry to cut you off. Are you saying 1.4% is going to be, after this, the total area of the stadium that's covered in signs, or just for this request is 1.4%?
It's 1 point, what the amount that is in dispute between the staff report and ours, and our request, which is, I think, 4,280. So that's the sort of the 7 sign areas that the staff report recommends disapproval of. That adds up to 4,280. So
Gotcha.
that 4,280 is, so I think that adding that 1.4% is not creating clutter that didn't exist before, in my opinion. But also, I think it's just really important to think about the location that we're talking about here. Like we're not talking about the premise of this is also about what's happening around its neighbors around downtown. And we're talking about something that faces on one level the river, on the other side it faces the practice facility for the team and a bridge. And the one side it faces some sort of bridge off ramps, and then eventually downtown. And then on the east side it faces the banks, but even right next to it is the Brady Center. And so you're just not having as much direct relationship with your neighbors. I think that's a relevant factor here when you think about it. And I think there's a flip side to that, which is the reason you need bigger signs is because of that location. They need to be able to be seen. People aren't right next to the building. They need to be bigger so they can be seen, unlike many other places, including TQL Stadium. I think the public benefit of the community partnerships is real, and I think that's not something to be dismissed. There will be more of that if these sponsorships can happen. And then there's also a concern around sign clutter as relates to the sort of overall sort of sleekness. And I'm not sure if that was something that we said in our report or the staff report said or somebody else said, but like people have said, there's a modern sleek design to PBS. Somebody said it. And the team's proud of that. No one really knows this, but that stadium was I think the only NFL stadium ever to win an AIA Architects Award for design. Is that right, Brian? Or maybe has somebody else done it since? I'm not really clear on that, but I know that Paul Brown Stadium won one. You're nodding yes. The team's proud of that. They don't want to mess that up. They're not proposing things they don't want a bunch of clutter that looks ugly. They like the way it looks too. They're proud of it. And so I think that again, I think sign clutter as a general matter is a concern that this tribunal should care about, that the city administration should care about. I just don't think it's an issue here. So summary of this whole thing, and I appreciate you, David, giving me a little bit more time here, and appreciate everyone's attention here. Stepping back to the very beginning, this is really a square peg and round hole situation. There's just no way around that. These regulations don't make sense for stadiums. We all agree with that. We're all doing our best to come up with a good way to handle that. I appreciate the staff's recommendations and attempts to handle that. We agree on most of it. I think that what we've laid out is, of the small amount of area that we disagree on, 7 signs of 36 total locations. I think we've made an argument that those are clearly. I think this is all justified under the first prong of 1445-15, in that it would be unreasonable to have a strict application. If you want to think about how to decide this on the margins, which is the 7 signs, I would characterize as the margins between what we propose and what the administration recommends. I think you look to the second prong of the substantial property right. And when you think about us compared to TQL for all the reasons I laid out, and you think about Paul Brown compared, most importantly, I think, to other NFL stadiums and all the examples we've shown, I think this is directly in line with what other stadiums in the vicinity and around the country that are similarly situated are doing. It would simply allow the team to exercise a property right similar to everybody else's. And all of that with, we argue, significant public benefit. So with that, I'll stop and hand it over.
Okay. Let me just ask one quick question before I give zoning an opportunity to weigh in if they would like. I mean, I think we probably all agree that these regs don't fit stadiums very well, and it is sort of a square peg round hole situation. And I think that most of the city decisions and the prior ZH decisions would probably reflect that as well. But I mean, there is this sense of where do you draw the line, or do you just sort of let these stadiums sort of decide when it's too much based on what they think is aesthetically pleasing or not?
Are you asking me that question?
Yeah. I mean, where should, I mean, and maybe that's like, a larger policy discussion for city officials, but that's just something that pops in my head. I mean, what if you guys come back, next year and ask for more? Where should we draw the line?
Well, I think I'd have 2 answers to that. One is, I really do think, and I've had this conversation with Emily, with Mary, and with others, I really think that the city should undertake to draft a new set of zoning regulations for stadium that can be developed in consultation with the stadiums, with other similar users, and that makes sense, and everyone can agree. I think that I don't think anybody likes this situation of having to come back, go through this every single time. It's just not a good use of anyone's time. And I should say, we totally appreciate that the city administration, everybody's in a very difficult spot, because what is the standard? What are you supposed to do? What I can say is that we've tried to, one, sort of stay in line with what is a norm around what we see at other NFL stadiums. And so there is a governor in some regard in that sense. Again, in the absence of a more applicable set of rules, we do have to look at what the variance rules are. And I do think that if you're comparing, the sort of impact on the property right or equal treatment of the property right to other similarly situated owners, I still think we're well within that category, and that is some governor, right? You can continue to compare to other NFL stadiums, continue to compare to other, things in the extent there are this small number of things that could conceivably compare in the area. So I think there is still a governor there, but I just generally think that there should be a different overall policy approach to this. But in the absence of that, I think we're left with what we have. And again, what the team has put forward, we believe is definitely meets the standards and is truly in line with, and even does not go as far as many other NFL stadiums.
Thank you. All right, Doug or Emily, either of you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not going to go through the full analysis that we have. I don't have much to add based above what's in the staff report. So you have that you can review. But generally, I would agree with the majority of what Mr. Blocher has said here today. I think we're on the same page for the majority of this. And like he said, it basically comes down to that 1.4% that we're recommending denial on. But basically, yeah, we're all in agreement that the DD sign regulations did not line up well with the stadium. So that is an unreasonable requirement that we are willing to recommend approval on some additional signage as we have in the past on these. So, but like you say, David, that shouldn't necessarily be an excuse to, put up as much signage as possible on a building. Not that that's what's happening here, but so clearly they made the first test. When we come to the substantial property rights argument, it's a little trickier. One, if we're talking about other NFL stadiums around the country, we did not have any, good comparisons to look at with this analysis. We had some small images from a couple other stadiums around the country, but looking at what was shown here today, I think what we are recommending approval for fits in pretty well with some of the other images, especially the Indianapolis image. That's a pretty small amount of signage compared to the others that were shown. So I think that, we're recommending something similar to that, a little bit more than what I saw on that photo even, and obviously not as much as the Cleveland Stadium and some of those other examples. So I do think that the argument could be made that this is comparable what we are recommending approval on for some of the other stadiums. So
what about its comparison with the soccer stadium?
Yeah, so TQL, that's, the main comparison that we looked at on this analysis was the other professional sports stadiums in the city, since that is, something that is directly comparable within the vicinity and also, has been approved through various city administrations and boards. So that was our main source for comparison. And, TQL Stadium is very limited as far as their gate signage to very small, well, not necessarily very small, but a small area in comparison to the overall stadium. The gate signage is limited to the gate itself. It doesn't have any other images or anything to draw your eye to, that are put on the walls of the stadium itself. So that's a similar approach as to what we're looking for. So, that is more of a direct comparison within the city and within the vicinity itself. So that's primarily what we're looking at. The main signs that we're recommending denial on are the signs that are more physically removed from the gates themselves, like the escalators and some of the sidewalls and some of the, larger scale signs that are not directly tied to those gates. So that's where those 7 individual locations break down for that 1.4%. So overall, I think at the staff level, we are still comfortable with our recommendations as they were presented in the staff report. So.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Doug. Ms. Ahouse, did you want to add anything to Doug's testimony?
Yeah, I mean, I think Doug really clearly summarized the city's position, both in his staff report and his testimony today. We certainly support the Bengals. We want them to be able to compete for the marketing and gate sponsorships and provide the public benefits that they've described here. But ultimately, we're reviewing under the Chapter 1445 standards for variances, and we didn't find the full package to meet those standards. So that's why we recommended approval in part and denial in part.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Blocher, if you'd like to respond or make any closing remarks, you have 9 minutes.
Thank you. Again, I'll just say, but one, again, I appreciate the sort of engagement this throughout with the staff and the thoughtfulness with which they've approached, which is just a sort of messy situation. That's not anybody's fault. I do want to underscore, I really do feel that it's worth you, Mr. Sturkey, considering in this decision that substantive property right analysis, and I really do think that you have to use other NFL stadiums when making that comparison, because that's when it really comes down to it. That's who the Bengals are competing against for these sponsorships, and it's just is a fact that this is, as we show, that this exists in many other stadiums, particularly some of our peer stadiums, and almost in the exact same types of physical locations. So I think, again, I completely say this genuinely, appreciate the difficulty. I mean, it's the difficulty of this entire setup, which is where do you draw a line when the standards don't make sense, and you just have to make it up in some way. And what we're relying on is what's to Ms. Ayos's point, to the 1445-15 standard, and we hope we've given you enough evidence that would justify approving our full variance with sort of like some standard justification, so that it's not just I think it's not giving into the I'm forgetting the sort of legal case analogy, stupid thing they had about the parade of horribles, right? It's not, you're not opening Pandora's box by approving this, because the argument is directly tied to other stadiums. So anybody making an argument like this in the future will have to similarly tie it to other stadiums. You can't just simply say whatever we want, we like it, but or some element like that. So I think you're not. I think proving everything does not sort of create that problem. But again, I appreciate the challenge, and I appreciate this is a difficult. I think we all agree this is a difficult situation, and we will. I think I'd like to think the team has shown throughout this process, and going back to the message board process and previous variances for the stadium, that we're always going to try to work through this with the city collaboratively and try to talk through how to do this together in a way that makes sense for everybody. So we'll continue to do that.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate everyone's testimony and their time on this project. I agree that this is a tricky one, so I want to just take a little bit more time to review some of these documents and some of the stuff you shared today. Luke or Mr. Sells, I know that your season was recently extended. Good luck, by the way. Is there a timing component? Are you trying to get this up by a certain time this season, or is I'm just wondering in terms of how to prioritize this, if it's something that's going to be hopefully completed soon.
Brian, I'll let you answer, because I don't think it's. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we're we are trying to move as quickly as we can on this, so that we have the opportunity to move forward for the 2022 season. But those conversations, in order to have something in place for 2022, those conversations have to start really, really soon.
Got it. Okay. I think I understand. Do you guys have any other questions before we adjourn here today? Okay. Like I said, I'll get this out to you as soon as possible. As soon as I finish a decision, I put it into a PDF and I email it out to everyone in the hearing, so you all will have it just moments after it's complete. As soon as that's done, you can start working with the zoning department on the necessary permitting.
And
Great.
what I'll send to you wanted me to send you, I'll just send both of what I shared today to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.
We are
Thank you.
adjourned.